so pleased that we have the Right Hon Mark Field to join us this morning to talk about the practicalities and what it looks like and how best and effectively to engage with those who make policies, who make laws that affect what we do on a daily basis. So I'm very pleased to welcome the Right Hon Mark Field, please.
Sonia, thank you very much indeed. Listen, it is a great pleasure to be here once again at an R3 conference. My professional interest in restructuring and turnaround goes back really some 35 years ago to the time when I was a corporate lawyer at Freshfields. And I qualified in the depths of that very long recession that took place in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And it meant that some of my earliest hands-on experience was advising on directors' duties, moratoria, wrongful trading, and keeping creditors at bay. And for a junior lawyer at a Magic Circle law firm, it was an exhilarating, if at times somewhat nerve-wracking experience, knowing that in this field, the challenges of each working day can differ so diametrically from the past. And in truth, that was one of the things I loved about doing insolvency work. And I often say to all practitioners, whether in the law, accountancy, or as IPs, the sheer variety of the work makes it so exciting.
Say you've been helping Buchler Phillips in terms of navigating that political sea, but how do we, give us the benefit as a wider membership, how do we engage effectively with MPs?
The thing I wouldn't do is just to send out a standard email, which you can easily do by pressing the button 650 times. Try and really focus on a relatively small number of MPs who you can then develop a strong relationship with. Ideally on a cross-party basis, because I think that the interest in insolvency and turnaround that doesn't really have a particularly strong party political bias to it. So try to get a group together. And one thing you might try to do, because as you probably know, there's a proliferation of what are called all-party parliamentary groups, APPGs. Try and get an APPG on recovery, renewal, and rescue. And I think, as Duncan quite rightly pointed out, one of the things one always has to be aware of is that there are significant numbers of MPs who in their day-to-day mailbox are getting information either from struggling small businesses in their constituency or from creditors and debtors. That would be a sensible approach, I think, from both the R3, but actually all of your organisations to try to, there may be specific MPs in your locality that you can engage with, or from the R3's purposes, to have a small number of people whom you know that if there are issues that are coming up, you can very quickly engage with.
And in terms of identifying that small number of MPs who may be willing to get involved, that's something obviously R3 can do as a trade and should do as a trade association. But it's also an obligation on each of our constituent members to do that if they really want to have a voice.
I mean, it can sometimes just be random things, Sonia. It might well be, for example, a law firm or an IP firm that is opening a new office and gets the local MPs to open the office. And you start having a conversation and you recognise that MP either has a background or potentially will have some interest in becoming engaged on a more regular basis.
Or might be seeking a platform themselves to stand out in the crowd of the 650. And I've certainly had that in my own experience, representing an individual who was facing quite egregious but not quite extortionate credit terms, and had spoken to their MP who took up their cause, and it was quite apparent that she really wanted to make a name for herself and get out there and get within her own party, get the ear of those who have leadership responsibilities. Now that worked great for the constituent, but it also gave me the ear of somebody who was keen for whatever purpose. I don't care, as long as you're willing to fight the cause for us. So that's certainly interesting. But what are the key issues that our profession faces in the eyes of MPs? Because we know it from our perspective, but not so much from
I think what you have to remember is that, as I say, MPs are, there's a tsunami of information that they come across. As I say, they deal with a huge caseload from their own constituents. And inevitably, things turn up that become a big tabloid story. So one does think that the controversies around phoenixing, the controversies around how a pre-pack can operate, is never far from the pages, either the business pages or indeed, sometimes, what might make stories in the Daily Mail and their business pages. And inevitably, if you have constituents who are impacted by this, they will tend to get in touch and, a furore will then begin. And I think, what's been interesting about being here for the whole of this conference is obviously we've focused very much on the big bit of legislation that came through 40 years ago, 1986. To an extent, we've talked a number of times about the Enterprise Act, which will now have its silver jubilee, its 25th anniversary next year. But it's also important to remember that the reality is, any government, there's a limited amount of bandwidth. One of the concerns that I have about the deadlock that we seem to be heading towards in relation to our own politics at the moment is that there's therefore likely to be less and less appetite or time available for new legislation to come in. But what one also has to remember, it's not just about the headline Insolvency Act or Enterprise Act. It's recognising that insolvency has a generic interest in quite a wide range of areas. So there are always government consultations, coming particularly from regulators, whether it's the FCA, from other regulators, where there may be an insolvency-related angle. The other thing to watch for is there are a lot of statutory instruments that go through. In other words, relatively small changes to existing legislation that are made, but they're made at a committee level. Keep an eagle eye on that, and again, keep an eagle eye on which MPs are engaging in that process, because again, you may find, partly by accident, there are 2 or 3 people who have had a few words to say either on the floor of the House or, as I say, in a statutory instrument committee, who are going to be willing to talk more actively about all the issues around recovery, renewal and rescue.
And as you say, it's hard to envisage what the political landscape may look like going forward, because it feels like, and I say nothing about last night's results in the local elections, but it feels like there was assuredness before, and now it seems all bets are off, and we are going in a direction that may not be a direction of travel for very long, but so for that reason it's hard to understand or plot what we should be doing. We've had 40 years of the Insolvency Act. When I spoke with Duncan earlier, we eschewed the idea of a 5-year strategy plan. So, understanding all of that, what do you think we should be doing from a political standpoint to ensure our next 40 years?
Well, I think we've touched on it here. There's no doubt that everyone knows what we need to achieve is sustainable economic growth. We know, realistically, given our own economy, developing that at the SME, small and medium-sized enterprise level is of key importance. So in one sense, there's no real doubt about that. And I think it is worth therefore thinking, as I say, the way in which insolvency aspects play their part in house building, which clearly again is another priority of all governments, but also with other bits of legislation that are coming through, try to engage and work through in a relatively unambitious way about small steps of change rather than a big revolutionary change of thinking that there's going to be an appetite or indeed time for a major overhaul of insolvency legislation. And as has been rightly said, when we looked at the Enterprise Act, we saw the UK as potentially being a pivot between a US model and a European model. And it has been interesting that a lot of European legislation, even in the 10 years since we've left the European Union, has looked towards the UK model and that inevitable tension that is there between creditor and debtor. And of course, that changes over a period of time. But nonetheless, I think the flexibility of the UK system is something to be admired. And probably the one thing we all want to have in mind, stepping back away from this, is not to do anything that is going to undermine that that flexibility of our process, which I think makes the UK an attractive jurisdiction for insolvency and turnaround. And listen, I will slightly preempt there might have been some questions about where I think things are going, and not to in any way make a party political point about what is going on. And I have to say, I've known Keir Starmer for over 40 years. He was a postgraduate at the same college that I was an undergraduate in law in, I'm as amazed as many people who know Keir Starmer about the visceral hatred that he seems to have attracted from the British public and certainly from many within his own party. And I think the reality is that we probably are going to be having a change during the course of the next few months at the top in politics. But I have to say, I think the worst of all worlds would be, and you're already seeing this beginning to be mooted as an idea, the idea that there should be a sort of quite long-winded transition over a period of time. Because the reality is, and I only say it, again, not to be party political on this, because my own party back in 2022 had a similar situation. There was a long transition over the whole of that year. Started the year with the Partygate scandal. There were very difficult local elections 4 years ago. A confidence vote that was narrowly won by Boris Johnson. He was then ousted within a matter of weeks. Then there was a 3-month campaign for the leadership between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and the losing candidate ended up lasting 8 weeks, and then Sunak came into play. But what it meant was, there was a whole year when it was just the political psychodrama and nothing was getting done. And I'm afraid we're at an even more acute time of international affairs today. And the idea that we have the luxury as a country of going through a long-winded transition towards new leadership over the next 6 to 9 months is a non-starter in my view. We have got some real urgent issues to deal with, both on the international stage, but obviously closer to home economically. And I'm afraid the truth is, for those of us who've remembered the impact of energy and oil crises in the past, you ain't seen nothing yet as far as a rise in inflation, a rise in unemployment, a sense of stagflation, which will be governed by the international situation. And even if we had a situation where Iran and the US came to peace tomorrow, there's still going to be a long shadow, I think, of the economic impact of this, which is going to last for many, many months to come.
The reverberations will be felt for some time. Look, how do we best get across the message of R3 and R3 members that we're not undertakers? There are some entities that should be wound down, should be put to rest for the health of the greater body, but we are about renewal, we are about recovery. How best do we get that point across?
Yeah, I think you make a good point, which is that a healthy part of economics, and I'm a great Schumpeter man, the idea of creative destruction, that is part of how economy should work, that you don't want huge numbers of zombie companies. In many ways, the ultra low interest rates that we had between 2009 and 2022, one of the impacts of that was that there were a lot of zombie companies that it was in no one's interest to pull under, and that was detrimental to the economy at large. I guess the one thing I would say, and it applies really to everybody, in making our case, always bring up case studies. there are stories to be told about, particularly the work that is done in the insolvency world. As you say, it isn't just being an undertaker, it's not just being an asset stripper when things go wrong. It is making a case that actually an early intervention from experts here who understand both the legislation but also the practical reality of business life can make a real difference, can save businesses, can save jobs. And I think that's one of the messages that we do want to get across in terms of raising the profile, but also raising the reputation of what the insolvency and turnaround practitioners are all about. That we see this as being something that is actually a benefit to the economy. And as you say, an element of that is there will be change, but the change can be managed, and we can play an important part. If that means preserving jobs, but let's get some case studies together. One of the best ways I think you can engage with MPs, particularly I'm afraid as we head into the second part of the Parliament and the next general election is looming in the eyes of many of them, is to find some sort of case studies that are locally relevant, that MPs can properly engage with.
As if that was by design, I have in my hot little hand our Voice of the Profession report.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume that MPs like nothing more than statistics, evidence, demonstrable evidence backing up that which you're saying. It stands to reason that what you've just said is in fact correct, but they like the statistics. So the more we can provide them with demonstrable evidence of the benefit that we give, that we provide to the UK economy as a whole, then surely that must stand in our stead when having those conversations, when identifying those who may be on board with our message and willing to support us.
Yeah.
So once again, I do ask that when R3 sends out their call for evidence, that as many of you as possible can get involved with that. But thank you, Mark, for a whistle-stop tour through Parliament. There was one thing that what's it actually like going through line by line the Enterprise Act? Was it the best of times or was it the worst of times?
Well, I will tell you a little story on this, because on a previous bit of legislation that I was put on, I had volunteered to go onto it, and I remember it was the first and only time that I was on a standing committee with Boris Johnson, and we were new MPs in 2001, and he had been put on as a matter of punishment. It was the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is an even longer bit of legislation than the Enterprise Act. This is one of the funny things. It's often said, and I was a former lawyer, that people say there are too many lawyers in Parliament. And I always used to say it's a bit like saying there are too many doctors in a hospital. I mean, actually, having an understanding of the legislative process is actually quite a good foundation training ground for going into politics. But the fundamental thing that you also have, of course, is that when you come across a bill with 200 or 300 clauses in it, most laymen look at this and think, where do I get from the top to the bottom? As a lawyer, of course, you aren't as much fazed by it, and I'm often reminded. It's not a regret I have, but certainly being even now as a director of a couple of AIM-listed companies, I'm fairly numerate, but equally I look at balance sheets, profit and loss accounts, and I wouldn't say I'm all at sea, but I certainly don't have as fluent an approach to them as many accountants do. So I think having that sort of professional skill base that does make a real difference. So no, I love being on the Enterprise Act, and again, I was an opposition MP at the time. Of course, the reality of these committees is that if you're the worst thing to be is a backbencher in government, because you're expected to say nothing and just be there to vote and make sure that all the votes go through. Whereas as a backbencher in opposition, it's your chance to be able to speak. And because this was already, as I say, a subject that was of some interest to me, and it was interesting listening again to Mark Phillips yesterday afternoon. Obviously, he didn't think that we'd got it right. I mean, whether that was down to the failings of the scrutiny of the opposition, or rather perhaps the failings of the government at the time. But we sort of neither got, where I agreed with Mark is we never quite got to grips with what we were absolutely trying to achieve. I mean, there was this view we needed to move towards an American system, but we sort of came up short, and so that the whole issue around administrative receivership, I think, has been left slightly in the air, and perhaps in an undesirable way. But there's no doubt that did lead to the whole pre-pack disposition, which again comes with some controversy, there's no doubt about it. And I think it's one of the things that all of you have got to be quite wary of. If numbers of companies going under increases rapidly, and you do see a rapid turnaround of phoenixing and pre-packs, that is the sort of thing that is likely to lead to the sort of controversy in the press. You know, when certain creditors feel they've been taken out, and that, you know, poorly performing directors have been able to turn down their interests and escape from what are regarded as liabilities. So it's worth the flexibility that came with the Enterprise Act has also potentially a price to pay in terms of the reputation of insolvency procedures in the UK.
That says to me that there's a huge education piece for us to do, to dispel those. Sometimes they are valid criticisms, but by and large, they are not.
Yeah, and keep it personal and keep it local. I mean, one of the great sayings in politics is the American politician Tim O'Neill, who said, you know, all politics is local, and there's some truth in that. And remember, from the perspective of most members of Parliament, if you can get a local angle to it, it rises up their awareness much more quickly, because it's obviously something that they can relate much more firmly to their constituency work, rather than to just being, you know, a general bit of business and trade department work, which is the risk otherwise that insolvency related matters have become.
Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Sonia.
Shining a spotlight into the darkened halls of Westminster. I really appreciate that.